we are deteriorating when every little thing is I said, well, is there breakfast tomorrow morning? Oh, it's what do they call it? Walk and grab or something. It's just a table. They put out a few cheap things. I said, well, why is that? Well, COVID. I said, you mean the COVID ate the normal breakfast? It's all bullshit. I mean, COVID's the excuse for everything. You know.
That's pretty. So this is you're talking about hotel food. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
It's available at the hotel. And you say they closed their restaurant.
Well, they rented it out to say it was always on lease, and something happened. I don't know what, and I'm sure they wouldn't tell me and if they told me anything, it'd probably be a lie. So, it probably sounds bizarre because I think things are functioning pretty well down there in Texas and Florida and Louisiana.
We're having Mardi Gras right now.
Oh,
yes, this is the final weekend in for Mardi Gras, and so all the streets are blocked and thousands of people are out, and nobody's social distancing at all. They're supposed to be wearing masks, and probably about half the people are, but it's a zoo, and it's going full strength, and all the Uber drivers are very happy because last year was pretty dismal.
Well, today at the airport, while I was waiting forever and ever for the shuttle, in addition to the voice always telling you have to wear a mask, blah blah blah, federal regulations, they were saying keep tight control of your luggage. If you see any suspicious activity, contact airport security or a policeman. I thought, oh, what would be suspicious activity? Everybody's got a mask on. Yeah, I mean, what do? Well, watch for the Lone Ranger, or no, a guy without a mask. Oh, that's suspicious activity. I mean, it really this age requires Monty Python. I mean, John Cleese would have a field day with this nonsense.
It's kind of interesting. John Cleese has reacted very negatively to sort of the woke philosophies that are going on. Hang on, this is Sam Dixon.
Yes, he has. Yes, he has.
Hello, Sam Dixon. How are you, sir?
I'm fine. I'm almost home. I'm about 5 minutes from home.
Okay, well, you can join us. It's just Paul and me. Bill hadn't showed up, but we may start talking about Canada a little bit first, but because Paul is up in Edmonton, and I don't know what he's doing there. But just click on when you're ready, and we'll. I promise we'll let you in.
That sounds good. I'll have to cross-examine Comrade Paul and why he didn't trade revolution.
Okay, you do that. We'll talk to you soon then. Okay, so I don't know what's the situation with Bill Johnson, but for what are you doing in Edmonton?
Oh, I have a meeting tonight. I speak to our subscribers in various cities.
Okay.
And so I was in Vancouver for 2 nights. One, really my own meeting, and the other a small house meeting of some friends. And then I'm in Edmonton, and then back to Toronto. Well, back to Ontario.
And I was thinking about Edmonton. Edmonton is the only large.
Interesting.
And Edmonton is the only large city in Canada that's more than 200 miles from the border, right?
Yeah, if you say so. It may not. It might be 200 miles, but maybe only just. It's about 100 miles to Calgary, and then Calgary maybe 100 miles to the border. So yeah, it's maybe a little 200 or a little over, but it's not. The far north. No, you're right. Our population is absolutely huddled along the American border for the very good reason that that's where the arable land is. Canada's a huge mass on a map, but go much more than 200 miles from the U.S. border, and I mean it's Muskeg and Rock. wild country. Maybe a little bit of mining, a little bit of tourism, a little bit of fishing, but it's uh, not really very habitable.
They had a Yukon gold rush, but it didn't seem to make Yukon a second California somehow.
Um, that's a good question. I think it petered out. The gold. I don't think there are actually gold mines in the Yukon. It was mostly in riverbeds, and I was in Dawson City maybe 10 years ago. It grew within 1 year to be a city of 50,000 people. It's now a town of maybe 3,500, maybe. Um, it was an amazing place for from 1898 to 1900 something or other. It drew all sorts of poets, fortune hunters, prostitutes, adventurers, misfits. It was an amazing place for uh, for a few years. It's an amazing history. Jack London was there. Um, oh, Robert Service, the great Canadian poet. Jack London, of course, the great author. I always liked something London said because he was a hardcore member of the Asiatic Exclusion League, and some of his and he was also a socialist. And one of his socialist friends said to him, they were wobblies, international workers of the world, and they thought that Jack wasn't sufficiently, international. And he said, allegedly said, I may be a socialist, but by God, I'm a white man first, which I always thought was the right sort of way to think.
It's interesting because he was, I've heard it said that he was sort of a proto National Socialist because he believed in the racial subconscious. And even in his books, he talks about racial memory. In Call of the Wild, the wolf has racial memories of basically dealing with cavemen. You remember that?
I don't remember that, but that's perhaps not surprising. That Asiatic Exclusion League, which was active on both sides of the border, was a really interesting phenomenon. A friend of mine who's now dead studied more the Canadian aspect of it, but it was powerful before the First World War, and in Canada led to an immigration act that was a little somewhat similar to your Immigration Act of 1924, which essentially excluded Asiatics from Canada till the late 1940s.
Before that, there was actually an express in the 1880s. There was actually an express Chinese Exclusion Act, and the Supreme Court found it constitutional. And so, yeah, it was a fairly big deal. Can you hear me okay? I just realized it. Can you hear me okay? Paul?
Oh, yes, I hear you. Fine. Mm.
I just wanted to check this. Realize I hadn't got my external mic down here. Anyhow, though, yeah, the Chinese Exclusion Act was a very big deal, and we need it now more than ever. I'm afraid. I guess that would hurt Bill Johnson's business a lot, but a separate topic. Anyhow, the last time we talked, we didn't know for sure that Trudeau was going to what he was going to do with the Parliament, but the Parliament has in fact approved your bill, but it's now having been approved, it's been suspended.
No, well, the House of Commons approved it. Then he withdrew it. The Senate was debating it, but now there's nothing to debate. So yes, it's withdrawn. It is passed, but But I was just reading something. I don't know if it's true, but what moved him apparently was the banks were howling. There was a mass run on the banks in Canada. People were saying, "Oh, my money's not safe," and they were pulling it out. And as you know, the banks are woefully under. I mean, yeah, it's only a fiction that they've got the cash to match their deposits. They don't, and any substantial run is big. If that is true, I'm just beyond delight that people had the good sense to stick it to the banks because they
You got a bad connection.
they completely collaborated with the government to say, well, look, we don't want to. Sorry.
You've got a slightly choppy connection there. I don't know if there's anything.
Oh, me, I have a choppy connection.
Yeah, because you sort of freeze up a couple of times.
You don't freeze, but sometimes your voice sounds a little bit as if it's underwater.
Let me know. But anyhow, you're okay now.
Okay.
So so isn't that bizarre that I mean, he got it passed, and what inspired him to do it in the first place? I mean, it's easy to understand why he would have given up on it in light of a threatened bank run, but has there been any further thought on why he did it in the first place?
There are the given reasons, but they're laughable. By the time it was invoked, the blockages at all the borders had ceased. There only was the substantial number of truckers camping out in downtown Ottawa, which was basically a relatively minor police situation, not a national crisis. There was allegations there was big foreign money trying to subvert Canada's democracy. I mean, foreign money. There were hints there was Russian money. No, mostly American money. Yeah, that's right. The Americans and Russians are loggerheads, but they're both backing the truckers. It's laughable.
Now you see, you froze up just now.
And the American money, yes, about 40% of the donation. You want me to try to get a different connection? I mean, I don't know if it'll do any good, but
I mean, we can see you fine. We can hear you most of the time, but I wish I could figure out why it is that you're just sort of chopping out. It's literally chopping out occasionally, but are you on your hotel's best connection? They usually give you options of which one to subscribe to.
I'm not sure if it's not too bad. Let's go with this. Otherwise, I can try a different connection. What are we doing something tomorrow night?
We should, because there's basically a lot to talk about. I mean, there's a lot going on, and I mean, this week, of course, the big news is Russia is interfering with a foreign country right now in a fairly interesting way. And I was thinking about it from the standpoint of basically one of our favorite topics is ethnostates.
Yeah.
Ukraine is certainly not exactly an ethnostate. It's moderately diverse, but it is a small country that is sort of analogous to what a breakaway ethnostate might be. And I think that what's happening is kind of interesting to think about. I did this little summary of statistics. California has 38.9 million residents in 163,696 square miles. Canada has a slightly smaller population than California at 38,388,419. That's a very precise figure, but That's what it says. And you've got 3.85 million square miles. So you're 20 times the size of California. Ukraine has a larger population than either Canada or California. Ukraine's population is 44.13 million in 233,000 square miles. So it's slightly bigger than California, but maybe about 50,000 miles, 50,000 square miles bigger than California. The gross domestic product of California is 3.35 trillion.
Jeez.
Canada is one half of that at 1.64 trillion. And for perspective, Ukraine is exactly 1/10 of, or less, actually less than 1/10 of Canada at 155.6 billion. 1/10.
Oh, that's wow. That certainly is, creates perspective. And Ukraine is immensely rich agricultural land.
Sam Dixon is here.
Okay.
But
yeah. Are we going to start, or are we going now, or what's our status?
We've been going. We've been going. I don't know what happened to Bill Johnson, but maybe you can get him. Sam Dixon, you're there.
I think so. Here. Hello. How are you? Nice to see Paul Fromm, our wonderful government with liberty and justice for all that spreads democracy all over the world and welcomes Haitian immigrants, has hitherto now been able to protect us all from hearing Paul Fromm. They do have an immigration service that can exclude Paul Fromm. That make you proud of our government.
Paul is in Edmonton today, which is I believe it's the only major city in Canada that's more than 200 miles from the border.
Wow. Yeah.
It's pretty far north up there. And what's the temperature, Paul? What's the February temperature in?
We're discussing that. He might be it'd be about 28 Fahrenheit. So it's below freezing, but not by Edmonton standards particularly cold.
That's very mild. That's not a radical cold at all.
No.
That's interesting. Well, anyhow, Sam, we were discussing in relation. I'll repeat this. I brought it up in relation to the question of possible ethno-states. Ukraine has just been invaded, and I'm not sure exactly what's going on there, but Ukraine may disappear from the map as an independent country by this time tomorrow. It doesn't seem to be going too well for the sovereignty of Ukraine right now. And so I was thinking about some comparisons. California has 38.9 million residents in 163,000 square miles and a gross domestic product of $3.35 trillion. That's a lot of money. Canada, by contrast, has a slightly smaller population, 38,388,419, in a total of 3.8 million square miles, and a gross domestic product half of California at $1.643 trillion. The Ukraine is slightly larger than California, but obviously a lot smaller than Canada. But the population is larger than either California or Canada at 44.13 million. But the gross domestic product of Ukraine is a pathetic $155.6 billion US, which is less than 10% of Canada's. And even more telling, the per capita gross domestic product in Ukraine is $3,726.93. And that compares with Russia, which is 10,700 per year. And Russia's gross domestic product is roughly the same as Canada's, about $1.66 trillion. Can small nations exist except by the permission of superpowers?
Well, I think we need to put all these things into perspective of what is good for the white European race. That's the criterion by which another ethnic group judges all issues. And I think that's the right criterion. You know, the Romans had the provision salus populi lex suprema. The health, salvation, welfare of the people is the highest law. White European Christians have a dangerous tendency to adopt very strict principles and apply them without considering what Lenin called the objective factors. So, and that's wrong. Any kind of philosophy or policy has to be placed within the context of the actual facts. And the actual facts in Ukraine are that Ukrainians have been taken over by a race that is hostile to Russians. And Ukrainians are almost indistinguishable from Russians. They have the same ethnic group. Their language is really a dialect of Russian. They're mutually understandable, intelligible. They're both Orthodox countries, and their histories have been intertwined for over 10 or 11 centuries. So the hostility is false. It's not like the problems between Muslims and French Catholics in Paris. It's not something that is an intractable, insoluble problem. So in the case of Ukraine, I'm sorry that these two kindred people have been maneuvered into a situation in which they're at war with each other, but basically they should be friendly to each other. You know, in this case, the interests of those of us who are ethnic nationalists probably lie with the Russians and not the Ukrainians, because the Russians quite properly take exception to the United States overthrowing the elected government in Ukraine 7 or so years ago and imposing a government manned and directed by non-Ukrainians who have egged on this hostility toward Russia. So that's a long answer to your question. But I think all nations have to live within the objective factors of their existence. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania need to get along with Russia for obvious reasons. The United States, under this false Churchillian approach, seeks to encourage nations that border other nations to adopt positions of hostility. And we have promoted hostility toward Russia in Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and in Hungary. That we have, fortunately, our government has failed in Hungary, which has adopted a friendly policy towards post-communist Russia. But you don't do a favor by going into these countries and urging them to adopt adversarial attitudes toward a powerful neighbor. It would not be a good thing if people came into Canada and tried to egg Canadians on to adopt a belligerent and hostile attitude toward the United States. So there you have it.
Where does that leave us? I mean, it's a...
We had a very interesting discussion. We had a very interesting discussion. We had a very interesting discussion at the house meeting I was at last night, and on this issue. And the person I thought who was the most enlightening was a Bulgarian fellow, very strongly anti-communist. But he pointed out that Russia finds itself being not exactly encircled, but severely pressed from the West, and it doesn't want to have NATO on its western border. and that is it seems to be Putin's major issue with the Ukraine. He wants a guarantee that he won't have a fundamentally hostile nation on his immediate western border. Almost all of the old Soviet captive nations have joined NATO, and for reasons of similar to what Sam has said, the longtime Iranians, that he doesn't want that right on his doorstep.
You are breaking up really.
Similarly, if I am, I'm going to try to get a different connection and get back to you in a couple minutes. Okay.
Okay, because that was really bad right there. We lost about half of what you were saying.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay, I'll try to get a different connection. Okay.
Life in the cyberspace. So, Sam, I mean, let's just talk for a second about the foreign element that's ruling Ukraine. I don't think you're talking about a bunch of Italians, are you?
No, everyone knows what the group is. It's obvious. It's a group with a chip on their shoulder, a long history of unhappy relations with Russians and Ukrainians. A group that was extremely oppressive to Ukrainians during the Soviet period, for which our media now blames the Russians. The Russians are guilty of the collectivization and the starvation in Ukraine. That policy was not implemented by ethnic Russians. It was implemented by another ethnic group.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you can. We can hear you. It's just a matter of you coming in and out. But yes, you came in loud.
I think I've got a new connection. My understanding is that the president of the Ukraine, Zelensky, is not Ukrainian. Am I correct?
I think you are correct.
Yeah, and apparently after the fall of communism, relations were quite good between the Ukraine and Russia, or the Russian Federation. It was only, I believe, in 2011 that the United States started meddling, and I believe they pulled off what they call the Yellow Revolution, or it was heavily American funded, supposed democratic uprising in the Ukraine, but Russia saw it quite differently. It saw it as foreign interference, or, as I was about to say before, under the previous connection, what would America's response have been if during the Cold War, Mexico had joined the Warsaw Pact? I think there would have been some considerable concern, and that as my Bulgarian friend was saying, is Russia's position. So while the boo-hoo-hooing in Ottawa and London and Washington is really quite impressive, our position, at least my circle, is before we go to war or get too deeply involved in trying to protect democracy in the Ukraine, but why don't we protect it right here in Canada? That is our country, and it is our backyard. This past week, by way of kind of a little bit of humor, the Supreme Council of the Islamic State of Iran put out a strong statement condemning dictator Trudeau for trampling on human rights and democracy in Canada. That was actually good. It serves them right. We've been meddling in Iran for not as actively as the Americans, but we've been a big enemy of Iran. Certainly since the Harper years, or about a decade ago.
Paul, your point about Mexico is not just a hypothetical. The American government now is got its panties in a wad and is all excited, along with National Public Radio and the New York Times and the rest of the system media, about the horrible Russian aggression against Ukraine. Well, we go back to the Reagan years, and we remember that a Marxist government took charge of Grenada. And the United States sent troops in to overthrow the government of this tiny little island nation in the Caribbean, because we didn't want another government in the Caribbean hostile to the United States. So, this is pretty hypocritical for America to be pointing a finger at Russia when we have three fingers, as the saying goes, pointing back at ourselves.
Yeah, that's a good point. Something your mother said, not to point your little finger as a child at another child and say something nasty to him, because the three fingers were pointing right back at you. And it seems to me, if Russia's main issue is they want an assurance that Ukraine will not join NATO, then that assurance really should be given to them. That is the reality. I don't think America would put up with, let's say, back in the Cold War days, a pro-Soviet armed state on the southern border, like Mexico, a substantial population, and if it were armed, it just wouldn't put up with that menace. I think Russia feels the same way.
Let's be clear, we've had Cuba for about 60 some odd years right now, and it's still basically an alien hostile nation. It's opened up a little bit, and I know that Canada has always had freer trade with Cuba than we've had.
Well, they should, since their prime minister is the son of Fidel Castro.
I've been to Cuba, and it is a poor country. The Castro brothers have run it into the ground. It's a very, very controlled country. But I must say this: when I was there a few years ago, I was able to go to church, and when I sat down in a restaurant for a bowl of black beans and onions, nobody demanded to see my passport. Last night, up until very recently, in most Canadian provinces, the churches were closed. And last night, when I attempted to sit down in a restaurant in Vancouver after the little house meeting, I was denied service because I could not show them my vaccine passport. And I said, I didn't know we had apartheid here. They didn't like that. And then I said a few more things. And the owner came running out. You shouldn't swear at my staff. I said, your staff shouldn't deny me my human rights. He didn't like that either. But it's war. It's absolutely war up here. Yeah.
To get back to Ukraine for a minute, I guess I would. Do either of you know more than I do about the presence of this and the dominance of this non-Ukrainian element we've alluded to in the Ukraine? Is it true that Ukraine would have been in during the Tsarist period on right on the line of what was called the Russian Pale?
The Pale would have run through part of Western Ukraine, but most of Ukraine they were not allowed to. Supposedly, they were not allowed to settle, but that policy had really been shelved. It may have been on the books, but if it was on the books, it was like the blue laws that used to prohibit stores from opening on Sunday. Jews were running and owning factories in St. Petersburg and other cities all over the Russian Empire. When the Bolsheviks seized power, they were not. The Pale thing was instituted by Catherine the Great, and by the time of Nicholas II, it wasn't really in force, and they were able to move everywhere. Ayn Rand, the objectivist, a libertarian philosopher, her family were Jewish, and they owned a factory in St. Petersburg. And they obviously had influence because when she decided to move to America, she simply went down and got a passport and a ticket to get on a passenger ship and go to America, where if you were a count or a priest or a Russian landowner, you wanted to get out of Russia, you had to try to run across a border with watchtowers and machine guns. But she didn't have that problem, even though her family owned a factory and would have been supposed class enemies if the new Marxist state was really based upon class antipathy instead of ethnic antipathy.
How large is the Jewish population of Russia and or Ukraine as a percentage? Anybody know?
I think
It's
I
a
think
tiny
like
percent of Ukraine.
I think it's like 4.5, 5 million of the whole. I think it's like 2% of the population, somewhere around that figure.
So that's roughly comparable to the population in the US.
Supposedly.
And so how did this happen that Zelensky became president?
Well, I think we chose him. There was that wiretap that the Russian intelligence had of Victoria Nuland, who under Obama was our Undersecretary of State, and who belongs to the same ethnic group. And they tapped it, and she's now, by the way, back as Undersecretary of State under Biden. But she was talking to the American ambassador and discussing who we were going to choose and install to lead Ukraine during the overthrow of the elected government that Paul alluded to. And when she named the person we were going to name as president, I forget his name, I don't know if it's the same one now, our ambassador said, well, the EU doesn't like that person or something. And she replied with great elegance and diplomatic language, fuck the EU. And the only concern of the American system when that happened was that those bad Russians had tapped our ambassador. There was no concern that this conversation sounded very much like one might have sounded in 1956 from the Kremlin to Budapest about who the Soviets were going to install on their conquered territory. And then, of course, that's our media never asks questions; it always obeys. But yeah, I mean, we basically the oligarchs came back immediately. They were back, and one oligarch was at once made governor of a whole province of Ukraine. So there you have it.
Now, hang on, you said one oligarch was made a governor of a whole.
One oligarch came back and was immediately made governor of a province. So the pigs got their snouts back in the troughs again. And that's really why we hate Putin, is he got the pig snouts out of the trough. And to avoid criminal prosecution, most of them ended up living in the United States and in Great Britain. And they also are furious at Putin for stopping the plunder.
And there's also the thing that Donald Trump was on to, and that was the very odoriferous connection between Junior Biden and Ukraine. He's got some immensely well-paid position as a director of an oil company about which he knows practically nothing. It has all the smell of a huge payoff. There's and my Bulgarian friend was saying that Ukraine is one of the major money laundering operations in the world. So there's some dark interests there.
That was a remarkable story that they attacked Trump for trying to incentivize the criminal investigation into serious corruption. He was a bad person because he tried to get them to renew a criminal investigation that had been stopped at the demand of Vice President Biden, a criminal investigation that pointed directly at a company on whose board of directors his son, Hunter Biden, sat. And there was the American people, especially the liberal element that listens and believes, the people who are obedient to the media, they did not see the obvious problem with this, that which is worse, a Vice President Biden threatening to cut off foreign aid to Ukraine if they didn't stop investigating criminal activity, or a president encouraging them to renew an investigation into criminal activity. But that point was never made about what was going on. And instead, the media just focused entirely on Trump making the call. And we know exactly what Biden did because he bragged to the Council on Foreign Relations as a videotape of him bragging about how he used American power to stop this investigation. On the few occasions I heard it ever brought up, National Public Radio, which is a reliable lackey of the occupation government, they said that it was entirely different because Biden's threat to cut off foreign aid if they didn't stop the investigation of his son's company was official policy of the United States. Well, I guess that answers that. Doesn't that make you proud? Makes you so proud of our country. And NPR can have a little swell of pride that they're Americans because it was okay, because it was the official policy. Well, I might ask, who made it the official policy? It seems to me that the president, who runs our foreign policy under our constitutional setup, I would think Trump's demand that they renew the prosecution. Why would that not be official policy as opposed to the vice president making this call? But anyway, it's all obvious. Everybody listening to this podcast understands it. The problem is that 150 million other Caucasian Americans don't get it. And they never hear something like this.
Well, what is the future of Caucasian America? I mean, we've got an affirmative action nominee to the Supreme Court now. And as a lawyer, what do you think of this woman, and what do you think of this appointment?
I don't know anything about it. Actually, I've been busy all week, and I have not had a really rough week of business commitments. I heard something. I came into National Public Radio late today, and they were talking about how she had been approved by bipartisan support, and she had been a judge longer than 4 members of the U.S. Supreme Court, and all this. You know, it's the racial spoils system. I think there's now only I don't know if there's a single white Protestant on the court now.
Kavanaugh.
There are four Jews and 5 Christians, and you know. So anyway, it doesn't really matter. I mean, in a sense, it's good for us to have these policies announced by people who are clearly of another race. You know, having somebody like the so-called conservative Republicans announcing these policies, and they can get people to accept them. But the bias is obvious on its face when you look at people like Sotomayor or this new nominee, people like that. Clarence Thomas, it's obviously Clarence Thomas who's made some really remarkably horrible rulings that people have not been told about.
It's interesting. You see, Clarence Thomas is a particularly interesting case because a lot of conservatives really like him. And I think that that's because they really don't read his opinions. He's widely praised for his, particularly his Second Amendment endorsement. But have you read those opinions?
I have not. I've not read them, but I'm aware that on racial opinions, when it comes to race in the First Amendment, he is one of the worst justices in American history. He wrote an opinion in a case coming out of Virginia, where the Virginia Supreme Court had struck down a Virginia statute on the grounds that it violated the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and he overruled that and said it did not. And he, in a nutshell, his opinion was that the government can criminalize the possession of hate symbols on private property. So, you know, we're now in the situation that people are in Britain and Canada. We're under the constitutional law as announced by Clarence Thomas and the majority of the Supreme Court. They have the power to say things like the Confederate flag is a hate symbol and you can't have it on your private property.
Didn't that case refer to the lighting of a cross on private property?
Yeah, I mean, the 3 of us are not into the Ku Klux Klan. I'd say, despite what the media, what the Supreme Court of the appellate court in Michigan said, I am not now nor ever have been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. But I do believe in the First Amendment, and on a privately owned farm. 4 or 5 people got together and they put gasoline on a cross and lit it on fire. And a black man was crossing a bridge some distance away and saw a fire and was able to make out eventually that it was actually a cross, and he called the police. The police came and arrested them under the Virginia hate laws, and they defended themselves, saying this is our property. It was a private gathering. It's not a crime. It's our freedom of speech. The system has always previously, during the McCarthy era and after, championed symbolic freedom of speech. The hippies had a right to put the American flag on their behinds and sit on it, and people had a right to burn the American flag, and people had a right to have hammers and sickles and things like that. But in this case, the Virginia Supreme Court ruled that, the law is unconstitutional if you apply it to this situation. You can't prevent people from doing this on their private property. But that's not what Clarence Thomas felt. If something is offensive to Black people or other powerful, well-organized ethnic groups, they can now come onto your property and say you can't have it. And it's only a question of time before that'll apply to the Confederate flag. Once you get it going. The other great breakthrough he had was what he called government speech. He has pioneered an idea that the government has a First Amendment right to its speech, and therefore the government can deny public facilities to dissident groups of whom it disapproves. We had an example of that in the city of Alpharetta, Georgia, not long ago, where the Sons of Confederate Veterans had historically taken part in a Veterans Day parade that had been going on for over a century in Alpharetta. The new city manager said that they couldn't take part. Alpharetta would not allow the display of a Confederate flag. Although the Democratic Party was allowed to have a float, they were okay, but not a Confederate flag. So the federal courts have ruled that the city of Alpharetta has a right to freedom of speech under the government speech doctrine, and they have a right to deny participation in a publicly funded event like a parade to people of whose speech the government disapproves, because people might think the government was saying that. So the next step is going to be a decision, probably in Tennessee, that the American Renaissance organization cannot rent government facilities in parks. The only way we have any freedom of speech in America now at all is through socialism. Only through government facilities can we have a meeting, and they want to take that away. And it's a logical extension. If the government can deny participation in a public event like the Veterans Day Parade, why can't they deny the use of public facilities to dissidents? So Thomas has really been very effective for the minority racists and the others who want to shut down the First Amendment. He's done yeoman's labor for that.
And what's particularly interesting about his Second Amendment, I know lots of Second Amendment advocates, and they say, "Oh, Thomas is great. He wrote very strong opinions in support of the Second Amendment, particularly in the city of Chicago v. McDonald about 12 years ago." And if you read that decision, it's absolutely terrifying, because he supports the Second Amendment because he wants Black people to be able to shoot white people. And he says very clearly, it's not, and he says this is part of the incorporation doctrine of the 14th Amendment to the states, that the 14th Amendment was specifically adopted to give Blacks the access to guns to make sure that they could kill their white oppressors.
Wow, that is really something. I'll have to read that. That's something that I'm surprised I have not heard about.
I think it's because so many conservatives are just they're dying for anything that is remotely pro Second Amendment, and so basically advocacy of racial violence is something that they're willing to put up.
Well, I hate the term conservative, as I've said before. I think we make a big mistake by labeling ourselves as rightists or conservatives or liberals. It's a division of our people. We're advocates for our people. We're not in a philosophy club. And some things that so-called liberals believe in are good for our race, and some things that are not. But the official conservatives and things like the Federalist Society, my impression, they're mostly interested in the rights of big business to pour uranium waste into the water supply and pollute the atmosphere. They're interested in big business. And the big business element has never been interested in the First Amendment or the Bill of Rights. They regard people like us as just nuts that interfere with their business, and they're quite happy to see the Bill of Rights curtailed in the interest of their profit. What is that squeaking sound? Are you aware of that, Carl?
Hello?
It was going the last time we were on. Some sort of a squeaking and noise making thing that's going on. Can you hear that?
I can. Paul, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Your face is frozen.
Oh my God.
I don't think that is that okay. That noise disappeared.
That's gone. Good.
That's interesting. But your face is totally frozen. You're looking down. You're in the darkness.
We have what Sam said about business has been driven home very, very dramatically during this whole COVID crisis. Big businesses have sided utterly with government against the interests of the people. Quite happy to trample rights, forced masking, forced vaccinating. They're entirely cool with that. So I used to consider myself a conservative, but to look to a bit and fairly pro business, but to look to business to protect our rights, or to even cherish our rights. It's just not in the cards. In many cases, businesses are led by people thoroughly indoctrinated in cultural Marxism, and they're prepared to live with a sort of a contradiction in character. Supposedly, businesses exploit the people, but that's okay. They salve their conscience by being very progressive, funding, in the United States, funding the very left-wing Democrats, funding Black Lives Matter. The delicious little touch of irony. Some of the local Black Lives Matter people in Toronto are all upset because it turns out that the Black Lives Matter Foundation in the United States recently purchased the headquarters of the old Communist Party in downtown Toronto for $8.7 million. And they had a couple of questions. Well, where did BLM get all that money? And maybe it ought to be used more for what they call, I guess they would call community-oriented projects rather than buying a big headquarters. But the point being that they have a lot of money, and a lot of it comes from big business, and we're operating totally against the interests of white people, against, in many cases, their own people. So
big business has given over $1 billion to the Black Lives Matter movement. $1 billion. That's about 1,500 times the annual operating budget of American Renaissance. For one leftist, white-hating cause that has no statistical basis in reality. It's based all upon anecdotes, and the statistics completely refute it. But yeah, Paul, the nature of a businessman, and I don't mean to kick sand in the face of all businessmen. I've been a businessman myself, and we're not talking about all of them. But basically, to be a businessman is to be what I used to hear people call a pleaser. Have either of you heard the term pleaser? They use it with regard to children in my family, that some child that was being too nice and too suck up, that we've got to stop him from being a pleaser. Businesses stay open by pleasing people. The restaurant owner walks around and asks, how are the string beans? Everything okay? You need some more iced tea? That kind of person is not the kind of person who's going who created our rights as Anglo-Saxons and thereby for other related peoples in America. Our rights as Anglo-Saxons were won by people that went out, mostly aristocrats, who went out in the field and fought. They raised their tenants and they went out and fought. And they established things like the right to a jury trial and the right to freedom of speech and things like that. Businessmen are just not the kind of people that are going to go out and fight for the Bill of Rights. They're just not going to do that.
Well, I see. I get that type of businessman, but we have another one. Maybe in Canada, maybe you don't in the States, and that one is so arrogant and dismissive of customers. And I say, I know I'm in Canada. The customer's always wrong. They simply take the customer for granted, and if you dare, cheap the slightest objection, they want to turf you out, like happened last night to me.
Paul, they know that they face that it's much more important that they please the regulatory agencies that regulate them. That they stay in good with City Hall on the local level and the national government on the top level. So there are times when they have to exclude the customer. The huge number of interracial advertisements on television now. I'm sure that a lot of people, mostly white people, but even some black people, don't like this. But they probably actually lose business by running these ads. But it's a form of protection insurance. It ensures that the federal government will not audit them for taxes. It will not enforce the OSHA rules. They won't be indicted for some kind of stock offense. So I don't think this is really voluntary. I think it's something they realize that they've got to do this, and they do it because they don't have the backbone that our people had 500 years ago.
Oh, who is the conservative businessman who's made quite a name for himself with pillows?
Mike Lindell.
Yeah.
Well, he was coming up with 10,000 pillows to help the truckers and Bibles. They stopped him at the border and booted him out. which just goes to show you the values of the Canadian government. Meanwhile, over the past several years, over 50,000 illegals, many of them from Haiti and Nigeria, have poured across the American border, across what's called the Roxham Road into Quebec. It's an open field, and the government never quite got around to building a fence or building a wall or anything. It's it makes a kind of a joke of border security, but talking about the sort of people that are kept out of Canada.
Speed Sue, how are you?
Pretty good.
You're going to have to step away to open the door here for a guest. I'll be back.
It's good to see you, Bill. How you doing?
Hi, did you just say I'm an hour late?
Yes, you're an hour late.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Hey, we're happy to have you. Welcome. I'll go back to these boring statistics that I started off with, but you're part of the picture. So I started off with the question of what the possible significance of the invasion of Ukraine is for the future of the idea of ethno-states, because it seems like small countries may have a problem these days. And your country of California has the Republic of California has 38.9 million residents in 163,696 square miles, and a gross domestic product of 3.35 trillion. We compare that to Canada. Canada has a gross domestic product of half California, with $1.64 trillion. 30 is almost the same population, slightly less, about 500,000 less, I guess. 38.388 million people in 3.85 million square miles. Paul, whose picture is frozen for some reason, is up in Edmonton, which is the only major city in Canada which is more than 200 miles from the border. And so the effective population of inhabited area of California is probably a lot less. And then the Ukraine. The Ukraine has slightly more territory than California, about 50,000 more square miles at 233,031 square miles, but a population of 44.13 million. And the interesting thing is that Ukraine, with that population, has less than 1/10 the gross domestic product of Canada at $155.6 billion, which comes out to a per capita of $3,726.97, which is
Sure.
1/3 of Russia's.
Okay. I'm sorry for coming an hour late. And the main reason I want to come on here is I want to know Sam Dixon's nutshell opinion of what's happening in Ukraine. Which side does he come down on?
I come down on both sides. I've already made that clear. I like Russians. I like Ukrainians. There's almost no difference between Russians and Ukrainians. The Russian term for Ukrainians, which was originally a term of affection, but it irritates for Ukrainians nowadays, is a Malorus, a little Russian. My Russian tutor always called them Malorus, little Russians.
Now,
They are another version of the Russian people. And so I wish them both well. The division between those peoples has been artificially cultivated and exacerbated by the United States, by people who hate them both. I also would say that in defense of Ukraine, what Charles was saying about the low national product, Ukrainians are very talented people. Many of them are rather beautiful people. The Hitler complained, I believe, that so many of the German soldiers were attracted to them and were marrying them and this kind of thing. But there are a lot of them that are very attractive people, very blonde people. And under the Tsar, the output from Ukraine was just booming. The growth rate of under the last almost decade before the outbreak of World War I under the Tsar was never approached by the communists with a fraction of the suffering that the communists caused. My Russian tutor would point out that, especially due to Ukraine, under the Tsar, Russia fed Europe. Under the communists, they never were able to feed themselves in the Soviet Union. But they could really be something under the right kind of government, a government that really put their interests first and helped them and educated them and encouraged their enterprise. The Ukrainians could really be something. I don't like a lot of this right-wing stuff in America, poking fun at Ukrainians and talking about them as a failed state and that kind of thing. That's not their fault. They were interrupted on their path to prosperity, as was Russia, by the Bolshevik Revolution, which set them all back hugely.
well, when I look at Putin, he looks to me like he's Oriental. And I think a lot of the Russians also have mixed with a lot of the Asians and have Oriental blood in them. But I think, aren't the Ukrainians whiter?
Well, I don't know. The Russians I've seen have looked pretty good. You occasionally see one that has a little bit of a Oriental look, but I don't think there was nearly as much mixing as people think. And you see a lot of really striking Russians. When I came across the border from China on my trip in 2018 to attend the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the murder of the royal family in Yekaterinburg, the first Russian I met was a young guy, who looked like he was a teenager, as blondes often do, who was running the Russian immigration control. And this guy was far more Aryan than 99% of all Germans I've ever met. His hair was just gleamingly blonde and cornflower blue eyes and tall. Later, I learned that he was a descendant of the Decembrists, who were aristocrats who were exiled in the 1820s. And I asked him, I said, I thought the communists killed all people like you. And He smiled and he said, "Not all, not all."
Well, then I've heard, the term white Russians, which I think it talks about like the rolling white wheat fields. But I thought it wasn't that the Ukraine, the white Russians,
Now, there are two meanings. It's confusing of white Russian. White Belarusian means white Russian, and you have a nationality that, much like the Ukrainians, is very, very close to Russians linguistically and the same religiously and ethnically, and that's in Belarusia. And then the term is used also for the Russians who fought the Red Army in what is called the Russian Civil War, but which by a Russian tutor called the War of Alien Conquest.
Okay, like that's like the War of Northern Aggression that you call the Civil War.
Well, I have a very similar view toward all the efforts to inflame opinions between Yankees and Southerners. This is not the issue. That might have been the issue in 1861, but I don't want a war with New England Puritans. Maybe it's because I'm 3/8 New England Puritan myself.
Well, where should a nationalist come down on this conflict? Should it be non-intervention, just leave them alone, or should we mount the bully puppet? What should we do?
Well, we have no influence in America at all, because we're the government hates us even more than it hates Russia. Our government does. But basically, I think we should wish both people well. We want them to get along with each other. We don't. It's like the same in Great Britain, where there are all these efforts now to stir up Scottish antipathy toward the English. That's a war we can't win. The white Christian community cannot win a war between Scots and English, and we can't win one between Ukrainians and Russians. So we wish both of them well. We want Ukrainians happy and Russians happy, and we want them living in harmony and peace with each other.
And I think the way that's going to happen is to stop meddling. I think we should be neutral, and I think the Ukrainians will have to give an assurance to the Russians that they will not seek to join NATO for reasons we discussed earlier in the show. I mean, that's, I think, the realpolitik of it. But what are the alternatives? A person who knows a lot more about the military than I do, and he's a big expert on World War II, and his son's in the Canadian military. They were viewing some footage of the Ukrainian army fighting the, whatever you want to call them, the Russian separatists in the eastern Ukraine. And he said the Ukrainian army is terrible. They're going to, quite apart from the numeric superiority of the Russians and the technological superiority, they cannot hold. I doubt, like on the news this about 8 hours ago, it looked as though they were collapsing, and I suspect that will be the result. So there isn't a Ukrainian military alternative to Russia. I know it's easy to say this from 10,000 miles away, but they're going to have to do a deal with them if they're going to maintain any independence. They've got to give Russia some of what they want. Some of what they want is not to have a NATO power on Russia's western border.
You can be independent without being hostile and adversarial. Ukraine didn't have any problem being independent until we went and overthrew the government and installed these people who are following an anti-Russian, anti-Putin agenda laid down by Washington, D.C. and the financial and ethnic powers that control Washington, D.C. They got along well. It's very fortunate for our system that the American people have such a short memory.
Yes.
I haven't heard a single reference to the fact that when the Soviet Union was dissolving, George Bush I, the former head of our CIA, flew to Kiev and made a speech in the center of Kiev. You remember that, Paul? He made a speech from balcony urging the people of Ukraine to remain in the Soviet Union. Back then, when it was a matter of keeping the Soviet Union together, there was no interest in Ukrainian independence by the American system at all.
I don't remember that. No, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, look it up. He did it. And it's all airbrushed out. It's like so many things that are airbrushed out.
Now, you guys have probably already gone over this, but you were talking about ethnic influence. In the Ukraine, are there very many Muslims or Jews, or are they mostly Eastern Orthodox?
There's the largest division is between the Eastern Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, which Ukrainians essentially are, and a sizable minority, what they call Uniats. And Uniats are a sept. They're a sect of the Roman Catholic Church that has a special sort of dispensation from the church, the way a lot of Arab Christians do. Their priests can marry. Their liturgy is said in Slavonic. They have their own form of mass. And they're found mostly in Western Ukraine, closer to Poland and the border. And these have been the people who have been the most supportive of Ukrainian nationalism over the years, because religiously and culturally, they are more oriented, like the Poles, to the west than they are to the east. But it's still overwhelmingly Orthodox. And you have a very large Russian minority, as you see in Donbass and in Ukraine and Crimea. Have I dropped off?
Pardon?
No, I can.
No, I can hear you. I can hear you.
I'll go on talking.
No, I just found it's called the Chicken Kiev speech.
Well, that's quite a change. I mean, it just shows the difference. In the Hungarian Revolution, Americans don't know this, but Dwight David Eisenhower, acting in a long history of pro-communist activities, when the Hungarians had successfully broken free of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviets had pulled their troops back to the border, Eisenhower busied himself sending a telegram to Tito, who was a believing communist, if a not quite controlled one under Moscow. And he told Tito, the United States does not look with favor on the establishment of governments hostile to the Soviet Union on the borders of the Soviet Union, because this was just a green light. Go get them, boys. And Tito sent the telegram to Moscow, and Khrushchev sent the troops in. And we were not interested in the Hungarian independence then, when it was a matter of keeping our former ally in World War II, the Soviet form of democracy, as Franklin Roosevelt called it, and the descendants of Uncle Joe. Eisenhower wanted to keep that going. And so we basically betrayed the Hungarians and worked with the Soviets to crush them.
And again, I don't mean to keep changing the topic, but now, if I were a Ukrainian native speaker, could I understand and could I communicate with Russians?
Yes, it's a dialect of Russian. There have been efforts to widen the gap by people who are interested in Ukrainian nationalism, but yes, they can understand each other.
Okay, all right, well, good.
So it's sort of like the difference between a Scottish accent and Scottish English in the United Kingdom and normal English.
Oh, got it. Okay, good.
Well, it's a very interesting situation. I mean, do you think that, more specific, how should we support the removal of Zelensky?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's not Ukrainian. He has a different ethnic group, and that ethnic group has an agenda that is very hostile to Slavic people and to Orthodox Christians.
What is his ethnic group?
Chinese.
That group, whose name may not be spoke, the people who are leading Ukraine now are mostly drawn from it.
So
not much different than the people who are leading Russia right after the so-called, but not really Russian Revolution.
Right.
So was the Orange Revolution? I almost said, was it a Zog plot? But that's perhaps political. Was the Orange Revolution then led by that group?
I'm sure it was financed and underwritten. Like I mentioned, Victoria Nuland, who is our Secretary of State, who's a member of that organization, that group. She was calling our ambassador, gloating over the progress in overthrowing the government, and outlining to him who we were going to impose, we not meaning the American people, but the people who run our country, we're going to impose as the rulers of Ukraine. And, it's very distressing. What can I say?
So I guess another question, do you think that the Ukrainian people, is there any chance that that Putin was asking, that was something I saw in the news, earlier, Putin was asking Ukrainian people to rise up against their government. Do you think there's any possibility of that happening?
No, you can't rise up against the government without organization. And you can have very unpopular governments. Without organization, they can't rise up. But I do suspect that a lot of the collapse, they're not fighting to the last man. It's not like, Bosnians fighting for their cities and stuff in Ukraine. They're folding up. And I think that one of the reasons that I suspect, I don't know, is that many people in Ukraine are distressed by the antagonism their government has shown toward Russia. They have an enormous Russian minority, and it's a huge minority. In a fair election, my guess is that 20 to 30% of the voters would be ethnic Russians, and they certainly would vote for parties that were opposed to this kind of hostile policy towards Russia. And I think that,
and there's a lot of, in the Ukraine, there's a lot of intermarriage between Ukrainians and Russians, which is another reason why I kind of lean toward neutrality. And as Sam was saying, wishing both peoples well. They're Europeans. They're white, and hopefully there can be a way that they can settle their differences, or at least regain that modus vivendi. Yeah,
which we interfered with, which we put an end to when we supported and engineered the Orange Revolution. We are the we are the sowers of enmity and hostility. That's the purpose of the United States in Eastern Europe.
Is there any possibility, do you think, that this war could spread beyond Ukraine?
Well, it's hard to say. You would think that these cynical people that use the United States to carry out a foreign policy that's not in the interest of the American people, that they would be wise enough to stay out of it. But they could be delusional enough to think that they can go in and fight a war. I wonder, what would we do if China chose this moment now to forcibly reincorporate Formosa, Taiwan, into the Chinese nation? That would really put Biden and his Secretary of State Blinken under a lot of pressure, because they want to act like it's 1947 and the U.S. is running the world. That's part of the big act for the American people, is make us feel important. But the fact is that we would be badly defeated if we tried to intervene against the Chinese under even favorable circumstances.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I did see, I don't know if it was just a fake or what, but supposedly there were a squadron of Chinese bombers that took a joyride around Taiwan last night or yesterday. And I don't know if that's an indication that this is a possibility or not.
Here again, the U.S. is a troublemaker, and we're trying to make trouble. We're strengthening the Taiwanese and their opposition to China. They're ethnically Chinese. They were part of China for many centuries. The best thing to do is you tell them you need to cut the best deal you can get with your countrymen. You're going to obviously eventually end up back with your countrymen in one country. And you should try to carve out a deal, sort of like what they've got in Hong Kong, where you retain a non-communist economic system with some degree of autonomy. And I suspect the communists would agree to that. That Red China would agree to that.
But it's not working out too well in Hong Kong.
Well, that's not that bad. I mean, it's not like it was under Lenin or something. They're not rounding people up, or under Mao. They're not rounding people up and killing them. And people are, they're not allowing overt hostility to the national government, but they still live differently from the rest of China.
Again, I don't mean to be flipping all over the place, but again, just to get an idea of who the Ukrainians are there any famous Ukrainians in America?
Not many. They not many of them came here. Some more of them went to Canada. Paul probably knows lots of them in Canada. I've known some of them here. They had a Ukrainian club here. I used to go speak to them. I spoke to them a number of times, and they were very friendly to people of our point of view. They had an antipathy towards the communists and towards people the group that ran communism. They all seem to know that. They told stories of what they had experienced in Ukraine at the hands of these non-Slavic people.
Now, I might be wrong, but if I remember right, there was a TV show when I was a little kid, and I used to carry the lunchbox. It was like about I think Johnny Rebel or something like that. It was Nick Adams, I think. I think he was Ukrainian. It was some sort of Reb. It was a Reb. Was it Johnny Rebel or Johnny Reb or some sort of? It was a TV show, and then I think maybe Jack Palance, who was that boxer in with Ernest Borgnine. I think he was Ukrainian. Those are the two Ukrainians that I think. They might be wrong, but I think those are two guys, and they're both pretty fair looking.
Yeah, they're nice looking. When I went and spoke to their club here, they had a very interesting color of hair. Many of them, the women especially had. I don't think it was a dye, but it was a blonde color, but it was kind of a copper, kind of a golden blonde. And you see a lot of them that have that, and they have very blue eyes. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Okay, I'm done with kicking around all over the place. I'll follow the conversation as Charles takes it.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's fascinating. I had never heard of Jack Palance before, but he was born Volodymyr Palahniuk, which is a Ukrainian name. But guess where he lived? He lived in Sean Donahue's hometown of Hazleton, Pennsylvania.
But is he Croatian? I mean, is he Ukrainian?
Yes, he is. Volodymyr Palahniuk.
All right.
Ukrainians now, are really being exalted by the media. National Public Radio has them on every day. The National Public Radio is just one constant booster for war and intervention. They interview very selected people in Ukraine. They're talking to them, and their so-called interviews of typical Ukrainians. They're talking about fighting to the death and saving the democracy. As in the Middle East, National Public Radio has never interviewed a supporter of Assad. I've heard maybe 700 or 800 supporters of the Free Syrian Army interviewed. So we're not hearing from the Ukrainians. They're not in favor of all this. But they, I imagine there are many of them that just want the thing over with. They want to get rid of the government they've got and come to an accommodation with the Russians and be done with it.
Yeah. And also, Charles, I'm looking at Charles Nick Adams, and his name was Nicholas Aloysius Adamczak, and he was indeed Croatian, and he was in the Rebel. When I was a little kid, I used to have a lunchbox with the Rebel on it, taking it to school every day. Now I'd probably get beat up.
Oh dear. One question I asked Sam, and I'll ask you too. What do you think of Biden's latest nominee to the Supreme Court?
Well, it's going to have, he says he's going to pick a black woman, and that just makes me cringe that he would do that. Now, as a nationalist,
he's announced somebody you don't know.
Yeah, right. I know, but as a nationalist, I mean, we want to say, okay, I'm going to pick a white Christian male. That would be, we would like that, but and we wouldn't cringe at that. But when he says I'm going to pick a black woman, we all cringe at that. And so I think that in a sense, making racial politics so much in the forefront might help move things away from the diversity as our strength concept to division again, and that might be a good thing. But I think for the longest time, the judiciary was the last hope for getting true justice, because the judiciary was primarily white males who were intelligent, who were diligent. They would read the cases and they would know what's going on. And now, incrementally, we moved away from that concept to making our judges of various races and skill levels. And I can see now in my 40 years of practicing law, although I don't go to court very often, I can see how we are in a precarious position because the lady justice is no longer blindfolded holding the scales. It's tipped very much in an uneven way. And this packing of the court with these various ethnic peoples is going to have a serious consequence to our country. And maybe that's what needs to happen.
I think it's much better for us to have a Supreme Court full of Black and Latino women than to have one made up of the kind of white people, the males that handed down the decisions starting in the 50s. So, you know, the more alien it is, the more obvious the fact it's alien, the better for us. And, you know, it's interesting that there's no pretense about justice anymore. It's all racial retribution and getting payback. You remember the remark of Sotomayor, that a wise Latina will look at things differently. And the law will be different when a wise Latina, that's just a flat out statement. I'm going to fix things for my race. I don't like white people, and I'm going to, my decisions are going to be guided by my antipathy for white people and my allegiance to my own nation. And you can't blame her for that. That's where she ought to be. We should be the same way. We can't live in the same country with people like Sotomayor. We have no business being in the same country with her. She needs her own country. One
thing that I really cringe at and really dislike among the conservative websites that I see is that they're all coming in to defense of Clarence Thomas and Clarence Thomas's wife. That just drives me crazy because, you know, you can't get a worse example of the destruction of America than a conservative Black man married to a white woman. It's just terrible. And so whenever I see these Donald Trump websites or these conservative websites, or say we got to defend Clarence Thomas's wife from the attacks, I'm thinking, boy, we're messed up when the conservatives take that attitude.
You were talking about Clarence Thomas earlier, and are you familiar with the city of Chicago v. McDonald decision?
No.
Conservatives love it. So-called conservatives love it because it's a pro-Second Amendment, pro-gun rights decision. But if you read Clarence Thomas's opinion, if you wrote it, you know, the State Bar of California would investigate you because in it, Clarence Thomas is saying the reason we need Second Amendment rights is because of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was adopted to make sure that Blacks could carry guns and that Blacks need guns to kill white people. I mean, imagine you writing that.
Yeah. Well, and of course, all of these decisions are not written by the justices themselves. They're written by very intelligent law students who've graduated at the top of their class and then spent a year at an appellate judge clerkship, and then they get picked to go to the Supreme Court based upon who they particularly like. So that is even more worrisome in that you've got the next generation of these rising law clerks are writing that kind of scary stuff and putting it in the Supreme Court decisions.
But
you probably have heard of the School of Critical Legal Studies.
Oh, sure.
You know, this is an explicitly Marxist movement that is really the dominant thing now in most law schools. And it just says that the way the law is supposed to function is the court, the first thing the judge determines is what class the various litigants belong to determine which belong to the oppressor class, the white patriarchal males, and which litigant belongs to the victimized class, and then to fix the case so that the case will turn out where the right side will win. I love a lot of something about here again. I'm glad to have that explicitly said because my experience in court has been that most judges decide how they want to rule, and then they tell their clerk come up with an argument. I don't think most judges are fair at all.
No, I mean, Bill, I don't know if you heard Sam's commentaries on Tuesday, but we were talking about the McMichael civil rights so-called conviction, and he was saying that he thinks it's time to basically abandon the court system altogether as white people. That there's no hope for us. And I mean, either yesterday or I guess it was yesterday, a parallel decision came down in the three cops in Minneapolis who were charged with Chauvin, also found guilty. It's a slaughter. It's a slaughterhouse for us.
Right. And see, when we look at it from the criminal perspective, that's salient, it's stark, it's apparent. But see, I see it a lot in the civil section where you have judges that are primarily lazy or incompetent, and they don't really give thorough consideration to what the arguments are. And that's why there is such a push among the litigators who work for me to settle everything, because it's such a crapshoot when you go before a judge for the rulings to be found that you don't know what he's going to make. And I think that traditionally judges were not that way, but over the incrementally over the last 20 years, with all of these, every judge in California is primarily appointed by the governor, or they run for office and they come up through the ranks as being a district attorney, or even sometimes, well, no, usually always district attorneys. And they've got this training and this indoctrination and the ethnic background that all militates against what we whites had supported for generations. And it is indeed scary.
Well, Bill, if you go back 68 years to the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education decision that launched the race mixing program in the school, there was no difference there than what we have now. You had 9 white males on the court, but we know now that Felix Frankfurter was meeting with the lawyers for the plaintiffs and feeding them points that they needed to bring out in their briefs and assisting them in their case, and gross violations. I think it was a disbarable offense for him and for Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall, who was engaged in this unethical conduct, was then elevated to be himself a member of the court. We know that that perjured testimony was presented, and the court later instructed that no one was to be allowed to contradict that perjured testimony.
And when I was in law school, my professor was a fellow. He was actually a member of our church, and he was also the state president of our area. And he was very important at our law school, and he went on to be head of various universities. And he was in charge of the commemoration commission for the Brown versus the Board of Education. And he grew up in my religion. He grew up, he was a descendant of Brigham Young and just all of this kind of stuff. And he was as left, and he was Rehnquist's Supreme Court clerk, and he was as leftist as you can get. So it's just the poison has infiltrated every aspect of our society, and it's we're just lone voices in the wilderness until we change.
Do you have people come to you who are in our cause, Bill, as I do, who have this idea that they can go into court and say some abracadabra words, and the judges would just say, "Oh, we didn't think about that. I guess we'll have to, take the Panama Canal back," or whatever. The naivete that people have about these courts is astonishing to me. The most radical people come to my office, and they somehow have this idea that when some system lawyer is picked by the president and approved by the FBI, whose character is carefully tested and reviewed to make sure that he has bad character, and then they're confirmed by the legislative branch of the government, and they put on that black robe all of a sudden they're as pure as driven snow.
Well-
I can't imagine people being this naive.
Well, particularly, I get some people contact. They say, "Well, under maritime law, this is and I get that a lot. And they say, and is that maritime law is one hook, and also like a freeman or something like that. I don't know.
Well, those people are Gnostics. They have their own secret law. But the whole thing. Judge Moon's conduct of the Charlottesville trial, his charges to the jury. You can be a member of a conspiracy and not know it. You can be a member of a conspiracy and don't intend to be. You don't have to have any intent to be. You can be a member of a conspiracy and be blamed for any kind of criminal activity, even though you have no basis to anticipate there'll be criminal events at some meeting. Mere physical presence can make you a member of a conspiracy. I mean, this is just fantastic stuff. And that's a white male appointed by George Bush the First.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to sign off because I've got a meeting tonight here in Edmonton, but I'll see you all tomorrow.
I do too, Paul.
Yeah, we need to go. I got to go also.
But I appreciate you all, and good farewell, Paul. I think of you often.
Okay. Well,
Thank you very much.
everybody. Thank you, Bill.
All right.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Sam.
Okay, goodbye, you guys.
Bye. Thank you.
Talk to y'all soon.
Do I hear the? Oh, leave me.
Well, that was an interesting.
Yes.
And
Harry,
hello.
I'm just trying to
Oh.
sign off.
Okay.
Yes.
You realize
Okay, thanks.
you've been invisible for the past half hour. I don't.
Oh, good.
Have a good meeting in
See you
Edmonton.
tomorrow.
Talk to you soon. Mañana.